Imagine waking up on a normal Tuesday, having your coffee, getting the kids ready for school, and discovering that an entire town has simply disappeared. No wars, no earthquakes. Without any warning. A real town with real people, with homes. Memories, stories. Poof. It evaporated like a bad dream, or as part of a plan that was never supposed to be discovered. What would you do if you knew that the government had secret files that connected this disappearance to experiments carried out during the Cold War? What if we told you that there are records of gravitational anomalies, radio messages with children's voices whispering, "They're here," and that a letter, forgotten for decades, predicted it all? We're not talking about fiction. We're talking about Elmridge, Colorado, a place that disappeared overnight and whose history has been pushed into oblivion. But why hasn't anyone talked about it? Because some truths cannot be revealed without consequences. Today, for the first time, we're going to tell this story in its entirety, from beginning to end, with all the evidence, the signs, the gaps. What happened to Elmridge will mess with your head, and maybe with your reality. Because in the end, the scariest question isn't what happened. It's, what if it's about to happen again? In the serene expanse of Colorado, nestled between pine-covered hills and enveloped in a welcoming silence, lay Elmridge, a small town with features almost painted by hand. The kind of place where time seemed to doze to the sound of the leaves, where the corner bakery still wrote down notes on credit in a notebook, and neighbors left their doors unlocked out of mutual trust and mutual affection. Every morning in Elmridge smelled of freshly brewed coffee, and every face was familiar, carrying shared stories, woven together by years of living together, respect, and an understanding that is rare in modern times. It was a town shaped by kindness, where even the mailman, Mr. Jenkins, knew the name of each resident's dog by heart. Children raced through the streets on bicycles decorated with colorful ribbons, and there was something comforting about the predictability of the place, as if it had been sculpted by hands guided by ancient wisdom. But like every calm before a storm, there was a barely perceptible whisper in the air, a silence that was not only peaceful, but also a warning. A harbinger so subtle that only those with true emotional intelligence would notice it. Something that seemed to say, enjoy it while you can. Because the night will bring more than darkness. Amid this atmosphere of almost enchanted serenity, characters like Eleanor, the librarian with the sweet voice and prodigious memory, and Tom, the mechanic with the easy laugh and greasy hands, were more than just inhabitants. They were living pillars of the community. The town was a tapestry of strong bonds and rare values like gratitude and honesty, sewn together with the generosity of simple days. There was a tenuous balance there, as if Elmridge were suspended between the world we knew and something beyond, an invisible boundary that no one dared cross. And though many scoffed at the stories old Margaret Doyle told on Sunday afternoons about something ancient lying dormant beneath the lake, or voices in the fog, even the most skeptical felt a twinge of fear at times. Because there are truths that live between the cracks of routine, waiting for the right night to reveal them. And the perfect night, in its bitter winter coldness, was about to arrive. That dawn would bring not only snow, but a revelation that would tear the soul of the town apart. And nothing would be the same again. It was a dawn like any other, at least on the surface. The clock in the tower struck midnight while the houses slept peacefully. The street lamps flickered lazily, and the wind danced through the trees with the same melody as always. But the dogs, curiously, did not bark. The crickets fell silent. And the silence that fell over Elmridge at that moment was deeper than sleepa. Kind of cosmic loneliness, as if the universe had held its breath. There were no explosions. There were no screams. Just a disappearance that seemed choreographed by something beyond human comprehension. No one would know it yet, but at that very moment, every heart that had ever beaten in Elmridge ceased to exist in the eyes of the world. And the frightening thing was that no one heard it. Not even the heavens. It was a transition as subtle as it was cruel, an imperceptible rupture between here and there. And it is precisely in this emptiness that Rick Malone's adventure begins. Because where the world sees absence, some see clues. And Rick was about to face the loneliest road of his life. Rick Malone was a man of steady routines, shaped by decades of driving, watered-down coffee, and country music playing softly on the truck's radio. He was a keen-eyed man, the kind who notices details most people overlook. That early morning, still pitch black, he was driving along Route 39 toward Elmridge to deliver a load of farm equipment. He had driven this route countless times before, and he knew every curve, every pothole, every crooked tree that served as a landmark. But something about that night felt off. The air was thicker, as if weighed down by a kind of silence that weighed on his shoulders. Even the engine of his truck seemed to hum differently, muffled. When he saw the old "Welcome to Elmridge" sign, now covered in snow and moss, he felt a pang of relief. But it only took 5 minutes on the main streets to realize the unthinkable. Elmridge was empty. Houses were open, lights were on, but not a living soul was in sight. The town had been swallowed up by a kind of absence that chilled you to the bone, the kind that awakens an age-old fear of abandonment. Rick stopped the truck in the center of town, in front of the supermarket that usually opened at 6 a.m. He looked around. The streetlights still worked. Freshly delivered newspapers were hanging outside. A radio was playing softly somewhere. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for the people. He walked around for the first time, calling out familiar names: Tom Eleanor, Mr. Jenkins. His voice echoed unanswered. He entered one of the houses. The fireplace was still burning low, and a steaming bowl of porridge sat on the table, as if someone might return at any moment, but no one did. Cars were in garages, cell phones were left on counters. Notebooks lay open on beds, pages turned to childish drawings of trees, stars, and eyes, the kind of scene that freezes all logic and defies intelligence. As Rick returned to the truck, he felt the crushing weight of loneliness. Not just any loneliness, but the kind that comes when the world around you dissolves into a nameless void. And there, at that point in the road, he picked up his cell phone and dialed, "County Sheriff's Department? You need to see this. Elmridge is missing." Rick's call set off a domino effect no one could have foreseen. Within hours, the local police arrived on the scene, then the fire department, then the FBI. The government would not ignore a mass disappearance without explanation. But right now, Rick stood there, motionless, staring at a doll lying in the middle of the road, a doll with scratched-out eyes, covered in mud, and dressed in a dress he swore he had seen before. In the back of his truck, the CB radio crackled. With strange interference, fragmented words like "they" and "behind." It was then that Rick understood. This was not a mistake. This was not a simple disappearance. This was a rupture. And as he looked around, he realized that reality had become fluid, as if the rules of the world had been temporarily suspended. It took courage to stay there. It took perseverance to face the unknown without running away. But Rick knew he was no longer dealing with a delivery. He was in the middle of something bigger, something that would require more than strength. It would require emotional intelligence, trust, and a good dose of faith. And when the first agents arrived, they all, in silence, felt the same chill, because there was nothing to explain. And yet, something needed to be explained. The arrival of the authorities turned Elmridge into an epicenter of perplexity. Helicopters flew over the region, sniffer dogs roamed the streets, and drones captured aerial images in search of some clue. Any clue. But everything seemed suspended in time. The houses, although inhabited until a few hours before, were frozen in a routine that had been abruptly interrupted. Clothes still in the washing machines, letters freshly placed in the mailboxes, even cups of coffee still warm. What was happening there was not a scene of tragedy, but rather of sudden abandonment, but without the slightest trace of struggle, chaos, or flight. The National Guard had sealed off the city with roadblocks and constant patrols. But the question kept ringing in everyone's minds: how could 1,200 people disappear without leaving a single trace? Agent Michael Pearson, a veteran of the FBI, quietly said what everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to admit. This defies logic. Not even the laws of physics can explain it. The silence that followed his sentence was filled with fear and insecurity, feelings that would soon give way to the understanding that something extraordinary had happened, and the world needed to be ready to accept what could not be understood. The search continued into the night. The investigators used thermal sensors, chemical tracers, underground scanning equipment. Nothing, not a footprint, not a hair, not a trace of evacuation. Everything was intact, as if the inhabitants had simply evaporated. And yet, the bodies were not there, which increased the tension among the agents. Hypotheses began to emerge: chemical attack, mass kidnapping, secret military experiment, or even a covert mass escape. But nothing made sense. The food had not been touched. The pets were also missing. Even the fish from the elementary school aquarium were gone. Inspector Warren, accustomed to the worst urban scenarios, sat on the steps of a house and lit a cigarette with trembling hands. "I've never seen anything like it. This here, it's like someone pressed a delete button on the city." And that night, under the starry sky and cruelly calm, everyone was overcome by a commotion that only the absent truth can provoke, because it was this absence that screamed the loudest. And deep down, everyone knew they were facing a mystery that would require more than science. It would require wisdom, perseverance, and perhaps a good dose of faith. As the news began to report the story in short, confusing flashes, a growing uneasiness arose among the field teams. With each new house searched, the hope of finding at least one survivor faded. It was like walking through an abandoned theater after the show. The set still set up, but the actors gone. In the school cafeteria, the dishes still served with mashed potatoes and vegetables seemed to mock the logic of the facts. And even more disturbing was what they found in the town church: benches lined up, candles lit, and a Bible open to Revelation 6-8, the verse about the pale horse and death. Coincidence? Omen? Or a warning left by someone who knew more than he was letting on? There were no answers, only a growing uneasiness that began to corrode the minds of the most skeptical. In the midst of all this, conflicting feelings emerged: solidarity among the agents, initiative among the leaders, but also altruism among professionals who, even without understanding, continued to search for a solution. And among the shadows of that long dawn, a certainty grew. There was something or someone who knew what had happened. The question was, when would this truth come to light? At the temporary base set up on the outskirts of Elmridge, silence reigned between blinking monitors and cold coffee forgotten on makeshift tables. It was then that something unusual caught the attention of Benjamin Kessler, a radio engineer on the communications team. During a routine scan, he picked up an unstable frequency, full of hissing and static noises. The recording seemed insignificant at first listening: disconnected fragments, high-pitched noises, heavy interference. But by increasing the gain and filtering the waves with specialized software, Benjamin heard what seemed impossible: a childish voice, low and trembling, whispering 3 words. "They're here." The phrase was repeated twice, almost imperceptibly, like a lament lost in the fog. The air in the room seemed to cool. This was not just a signal. It was Elmridge's last breath. A plea, perhaps, coming from a reality that was beginning to slip through his fingers. With his heart racing and a mixture of fear and fascination in his eyes, Benjamin ran to report the discovery. And that's when the mystery took an even darker turn, because the source of the signal was without a shadow of a doubt Elmridge's own central transmission tower. The same one that was empty. The Elmridge radio tower, a seemingly ordinary metal structure, had been manually turned off according to technical records at 2:47 a.m., about an hour before Rick Malone arrived in town. However, the signal Benjamin picked up was emitted at 4:03 a.m. There was no way the tower could have transmitted that, unless someone or something had reactivated it from within. The teams went to the site with safety equipment and radiation detectors. Nothing unusual until they went up to the top floor. There, they found an old reel-to-reel tape recorder, positioned in an almost ritualistic manner and still spinning. The tape contained only that one passage, the child's voice repeated over and over. And next to the device, written in chalk, on the metal wall, was a sequence of symbols that no one could identify, curved, intertwined, as if written by hands that did not know our alphabet. That awakened the perspicacity of linguists, experts, and even historians. Most disturbing, the pattern of the symbols resembled drawings made by children on the walls of the city school, details that had been ignored until then. And when they connected the dots, the feeling that emerged was one of bitter understanding. Something was communicating, but with whom? The days that followed were marked by growing unease. The press, kept out of the investigation, began to raise conspiracy theories. But inside the base, the experts knew they were dealing with something unprecedented. The recording was sent to international agencies. A NASA team, discreetly involved, analyzed the background sounds of the transmission and found vibrational patterns similar to those recorded in areas of deep magnetic anomalies. The conclusion, kept secret, the voice had not been recorded. It had been transmitted in real time. This changed everything. What had seemed to be just a last echo from Elmridge was now becoming a line of communication, a kind of channel that was still open. And the child who whispered, "They're here," might not have been talking about the past, but about the present. The inspiration to understand what was happening would require more than science. It would also require humility to accept what could not be proven. And in a corner of the laboratory, Benjamin heard that voice again. Now he was not afraid. He felt a calling, as if the city were asking to be heard, as if something or someone was waiting for an answer. To many in Elmridge, Margaret Doyle was just the old lady in the blue house, a deep-eyed, soft-spoken woman known for carrying a diary with her and chatting to herself while she watered her plants. Among the children, she was the subject of laughter and small bets. They said she could talk to birds, predict the weather with just a look, and of course, that she was half a witch. But the older people treated her with silent respect, as if they knew there was something about her that escaped common understanding. And there was. Margaret cultivated a wisdom that did not come from books, but from a rare blend of intuition, experience, and emotional intelligence. It was common to see her sitting on a bench in the square, staring at the lake with fixed eyes, as if waiting for something the rest of the world had forgotten. When the mailman found the letter she had never sent, everything changed. The envelope, carefully sealed, was addressed to the town sheriff. Inside was a single handwritten paragraph. "If anything happens to Elmridge, look to the lake." It was never just a lake. The realization was immediate. Margaret knew. And no one listened to her. The contents of the letter dropped like a bombshell on the investigators. Until then, Black Hollow Lake had been just a local tourist spot, with its peaceful shores, drifting boats, and patient fishermen. But now Margaret's message seemed to point to a center of gravity of the mystery, a hidden core, a submerged truth. Journalist Noah Chambers, who had been discreetly following the case since the first reports, delved into the archives of the town library, where, curiously, he found an old notebook with Margaret's notes. and it were observations made over the course of 30 years. Dead fish with no visible injuries, boats capsized without wind, children reporting hearing singing coming from the water. They had seemed like daydreams until then. But now, with an entire town missing, every line was a clue. Margaret wrote gently, but also with urgency. She wasn't looking for fanfare, just reconciliation with the truth she had been carrying alone for decades. Maybe out of fear of not being taken seriously. Or maybe because she knew that the truth, when told before its time, doesn't inspire, it scares. Noah took the notebook to the experts, who began reviewing old photos of the city. In one of them, from 1972, Margaret appeared as a young woman, in front of the lake, pointing to the water. And there was something in the reflection, a metallic shine, almost imperceptible. When they enlarged the image digitally, they discovered symmetrical patterns in the reflection, like geometric structures impossible in nature. The inspiration to explore the bottom of the lake came from there. But at that moment, before any expedition, a collective feeling took hold of the team, a mixture of fear, hope, and gratitude. Fear of what they might find, hope of finally unraveling the mystery, and gratitude for that woman who, with such humility and perseverance, tried to warn everyone. Margaret had left more than just clues. She had left a legacy of courage, selflessness, and love for her community. And even though she was absent, her voice echoed louder than ever, as if even in the silence she was saying, "You are not alone." And that was exactly what made the lake so frightening. Black Hollow Lake had always been described as a serene pool of water that reflected the sky as if it were made of liquid glass. But now, with the eyes of the world on Elmridge, it exuded a dark, almost sentient presence. Early tests by experts revealed something unusual. Any submerged equipment, whether underwater drones or sonar, failed to reach a certain depth. Batteries would drain abruptly, sensors would go blind, and in some cases, the devices themselves would reappear hours later damaged, in ways that defied logic. The divers in the special unit were the first humans to descend deeper than technology could allow. All reported strange sensations, nausea, dizziness, a kind of ringing in the ears followed by memory lapses. One of them, upon surfacing, in a panic, claimed to have seen a structure that shouldn't be there, covered in symbols identical to those Benjamin had found on the tower. It was as if the lake itself was breathing, hiding something immense beneath its dense silence, something that pulsed with its own intelligence. And once again, Margaret Doyle was right. The lake was not a lake. It was a veil dot as they deepened their investigation. They used high-precision magnetometry probes. It was then that they detected a metallic mass of colossal dimensions, buried or resting in the deep bed of Black Hollow. The readings showed that the object had symmetrical patterns and reactions to the Earth's magnetic field. But every attempt to bring fragments to the surface failed. Cables broke, winches jammed, or simply disappeared. Scientists began to disagree. Some spoke of unknown technology. Others considered ancient artifacts. There were even those who spoke of interdimensional portals. And as absurd as these ideas were, they all seemed more plausible than the conventional answers. The commotion was so great that it mobilized physicists, oceanographers, and even experts in ancient languages. And everyone, without exception, was overcome by the same feeling. That thing did not want to be discovered, as if the lake offered resistance, as if he himself were a guardian. And whoever dared to cross its secrets would have to be ready to face something far beyond their comfort zone. It would take more than science. It would take faith, hope, and a good dose of emotional intelligence. The tension increased day by day, and residents of the neighboring towns began to avoid the place. Tourists disappeared from the nearby trails. Fishermen reported sounds coming from the depths, similar to distorted voices. The water, once crystal clear, had become slightly cloudy, as if a fog lived beneath the surface. It was impossible to ignore. The lake had changed. Or it had always been that way, and only now were the eyes open enough to see it. The most experienced divers refused new expeditions. One of them, named Darren Cole, who dived for 22 minutes, came back mumbling in a language that no one recognized. Only later, with great effort, were they able to calm him down. In his dive notebook, he scribbled the same spiral symbol from the tower. The pattern repeated itself. The connection was clear, and the missing city seemed ever closer to the submerged core. Elmridge might not have been swallowed. Maybe it had been transferred. The fear was no longer of the unknown. It was of what they now knew. The lake held an ancient, living, pulsating secret. And, like every living entity, it seemed to be just waiting. But waiting for what? 3 days after the disappearance, in the middle of a rainy and silent dawn, a phone call interrupted the protocol of the advanced base. A girl had been found on the state highway about 14 kilometers from Elmridge, barefoot, covered in mud, shivering from the cold, but alive. When the paramedics arrived, she was sitting on the asphalt, hugging her knees, unable to say a word. Her eyes, wide open, seemed to see something that the others did not. They took her to the nearest military hospital, where she was identified as Leila Hammond, 6 years old, who had disappeared with her family the night of the event. The scans revealed something inexplicable. Her body showed traces of radiation, but of an uncatalogued type, not from space, nor from any known terrestrial source. There were also changes in her brain patterns, as if her perception of time had been fragmented. When they gave her paper and pencil, Leila began to draw. And that was when the doctors, hardened by years of tragedy, lost their breath. She was drawing eyes, so many eyes, surrounding a city that seemed to float, and in the sky, symbols. The same ones from the tower. The same ones from the lake. Whatever had happened to Elmridge, she saw it. The following days were marked by a silent race between protective instinct and the search for the truth. The medical team, along with psychologists, tried to access Leila's memory with all the care and empathy possible, but she remained silent. She just drew. And with each new paper, the symbols repeated themselves, with a frightening precision for someone her age. It was as if she had become a conductor, a living bridge between two worlds. Her presence awakened something in those who approached her. Some felt peace, others an indescribable anguish. When she finally spoke, she said only 3 words: "They look at everything." The phrase, spoken in an almost prophetic whisper, caused the agents present to exchange uneasy glances. Leila didn't remember her parents or her own house, but she remembered the voices and the cold. A cold that came from inside the ground, she said. It was impossible not to feel moved by that fragile figure, yet surrounded by such dense mystery. The girl who survived was not just a remnant of Elmridge, she was a key. And what she carried inside was still being revealed. Noah Chambers, the journalist, had been granted special access to Leila through a government agreement. Working with a therapist, he began recording every word, every image. And it was he who noticed something extraordinary. Leila's drawings followed a sequence. When placed side by side, they revealed a geometric pattern that resembled ancient codes used in protection rituals in ancient cultures. Some experts suggested that the language Leila used might not be hers at all. It was transmitted as if it were a medium, not the source. It was Noah who came up with a new term for this experience: cognitive echo. And as he watched her more closely, he realized that when she was drawing, Leila seemed absent, as if she were listening to someone no one else could hear. The investigators who had previously treated the case with cold logic now spoke with More understanding, respect, and a dose of humility that had not been seen since the first days. Something united them. Something greater than all of them. And while Leela slept, in her protected room, a new drawing appeared. A door, suspended. Over the lake. Open. Always open. And on the other side, what was there? Noah Chambers' curiosity, which already went beyond the limits of investigative journalism, led him to dig through public records, old maps, and declassified files from the Cold War. One silent night, sitting in the musty basement of a state library, he found what seemed to be a missing piece of the puzzle. Army reports dated 1964 mentioning gravitational anomalies recorded in the Elmridge region. The document, partially burned at the edges, referred to an underground facility called Orion Base 12, used as a test site for deep energy resonance. And there, among military codes and jargon, was something that jumped out at him: nonverbal communication phenomena with entities of unidentified origin. Noah, overcome by a mixture of fear and adrenaline, understood that Elmridge had once been the scene of something much bigger. Something hidden with layers of intelligence, strategic altruism, and unfortunately, planned disinformation. The power of truth was beginning to weigh. What was being discovered was more than a secret. It was a legacy carefully buried, and not by chance. With the help of a contact at the Department of Defense, Noah was able to access satellite images from 1971, revealing octagonal structures underground in the forest east of Black Hollow Lake. The base, or what was left of it, was buried, but it still existed. An expedition was hastily organized, with geologists and archaeologists specializing in buried military structures. When they arrived at the site, they found clear signs of artificial sealing. And the most surprising thing, sensors indicated that energy was being emitted, still active, even after 50 years of abandonment. The internal walls of the base were covered in a metal that did not rust, with inscriptions similar to those drawn by Lila. The connection was made. The engineers soon realized that the energy emanating from there was identical to the radiation detected in the girl's body. That changed everything. What had seemed like fiction was now tragically real. The team's feelings oscillated between hope and fear, sincerity and insecurity. It was like entering a time capsule made by hands that knew that one day they would be discovered, and that day had arrived. Amidst metal corridors, sealed doors, and empty rooms, a safe was found. Inside it were documents labeled Project Threshold. It was a top-secret program, closed in 1973, which studied the opening effects of space-time induced by vibration. The objective? To create portals between planes of reality. The reports indicated that tests had been carried out, but with unpredictable results. Some structures disappeared. Others reappeared in places not compatible with our geography. The connection with Elmridge's disappearance became increasingly clear and frightening. The city could have been involved in one of these experiments. And if Leela survived, perhaps she had crossed this threshold. The team began to debate not how to explain it, but how to contain it. The urgency was now different. And among all the documents, a phrase highlighted in red echoed with almost prophetic force. If something goes wrong, don't close the door. They will need to come back. Margaret's inspiration, Lila's whispers, the symbols on the lake, everything converged. But what exactly was on the other side of that door? The conference was urgently scheduled, but carefully scripted. On national television, the government spokesman took the podium with a firm but restrained expression. Behind him, the American flag fluttered in air conditioning, as if also feigning normality. Elmridge has been hit by a rare and unprecedented atmospheric event, he said, his tone surgically calculated. A phenomenon that caused seismic instability and extreme magnetism, compromising the infrastructure and requiring immediate evacuation. The words, spoken with conviction, answered nothing. They simply sealed a package of ambiguity, carefully wrapped for public consumption. Journalist Noah, watching the broadcast, could not contain his frustration. He knew too much. He knew about the girl. He knew about the base. He knew about the lake. And now he was watching a spectacle of half-truths and institutional silence. The audience saw explanation. He saw omission. And between these two versions, fear grew. Fear that Elmridge's true story would never be told. Fear that the door was open and no one was watching. Meanwhile, in the surrounding towns, people began reporting increasingly disturbing events. Children waking in the middle of the night saying they heard laughter coming from the field. Electronic devices turning on by themselves. Recurring dreams of faceless figures and red lights in the sky. It was as if the vacuum left by Elmridge was beginning to leak, seeping into the reality of ordinary people, scattering fragments of an unsolved puzzle. The collective sense was that something was still moving, like a shadow that lingers after. The light has faded. The inspiration that had once driven the investigators now gave way to worry. Failure to tell the full truth could cost them dearly. Omission could turn into repetition. And that was exactly what Margaret had tried to prevent. But now it was too late. The words spoken on national television could no longer be unsaid. And the people, they were the ones who carried the wisdom of instinct. They knew it was not an atmospheric event. It was something bigger. Noah continued his work in silence, driven by courage and a sense of responsibility that not everyone shared. In the basement of his house, among recordings, secret documents, and Lila's drawings stuck to the wall, he drew connections, assembled timelines, established patterns. His mission now was different, no longer to discover, but to reveal. Because the truth, even hidden, pulses. And he knew that a well-told lie can reassure for a while, but never forever. The public was beginning to suspect. The doubt planted bore fruit. What if it's still happening? Someone commented on an online forum. What if Elmridge wasn't destroyed but displaced? Theories grew, fueled by increasingly disturbing signs. History needed to be told. Not for glory, but for necessity. For humanity. And perhaps, to give a chance for reconciliation between two worlds. Because if there was a door, it hadn't closed yet. Noah Chambers sat in his darkened office, surrounded by stacks of reports, notebooks, and audio tapes. On his laptop, a single file flickered across the screen. Margaret_final.wav. It was one of the last documents recovered from a forgotten box in the basement of the old woman's old house of file that at first glance appeared corrupted. But when he opened the audio, a voice came through, clear, steady, almost maternal. "The town didn't disappear," Margaret said with eerie calm. "She just crossed over to the other side." The sentence made Noah's blood run cold. He knew what it meant. What everyone suspected, deep down. Elmridge hadn't been erased, but transported. To where, no one knew. But the idea of a transition, of a dimensional rupture, as Project Threshold suggested, left scars that were not easily erased. It was a revelation that required more than courage. It required faith. It required emotional intelligence to accept that reality is not as static as we like to think, and that there are, indeed, places between worlds, doors that sometimes open. Without warning. Deep in Noah's chest, something changed. He no longer felt like just an investigator. He had become a guardian, a messenger of something that might never be fully understood, but that needed to be told. Because if Elmridge had really crossed over, and if Leela had returned as a witness, what else could possibly pass through the same crack? Margaret had said, "They are here." And Leela had added, "They watch everything." Between those two statements was a bridge of silences, enigmas, and secrets yet to be revealed. And the absent city was only the beginning. The events around the lake were intensifying. Nightly resonances, magnetic waves, collective dreams in distant cities. It was as if a part of Elmridge was still trying to communicate, screaming, whispering, waiting, and the question forming in Noah's mind, the same one he knew the whole world would soon ask, was as terrifying as it was inevitable. What if it's not over? The camera in the final scene freezes on Noah's face as he listens to Margaret's audio again. There's a tear, a held breath. He knows the world isn't ready. And yet he needs to hear it. Because whatever Elmridge has faced, it hasn't ended with his journey. The connection remains, the signals continue, and the door remains open. Among the files, Noah finds a final note, handwritten by Margaret. Some truths are like seeds, they grow in the dark. He closes his eyes for a second. When he opens them, he seems to see, not with his eyes, but with instinct, this silhouette of something on the other side of the lake. It's not human, but it's not hostile either. It's waiting, maybe for him, maybe for all of us. And then, in an act of silent resilience, he turns on his camera. Because now, more than ever, the world needs to know. And the story of Elmridge is just beginning. So tell me, after all this, do you still believe that we live in a world where everything is explainable? How many Elmridges are there out there, hidden by ready-made speeches and well-made reports? How many signs have you ignored because you thought it was just a coincidence? The story of this city is more than a mystery, it's a warning. About listening to what is silenced, about seeing what is hidden in the ordinary. Because sometimes, the invisible is exactly what screams the loudest. Now, tell me honestly, are you going to keep living your life the same way, as if none of this matters? Or are you going to open your eyes and see what is right in front of you? What else needs to disappear from your life for you to start searching for the truth? Sometimes, it's not a city that disappears. It's your purpose, it's your voice, it's your courage to question. What if all of this is connected? What if Elmridge is just the first warning? If this story touched you, then don't let that feeling pass you by. Subscribe to the channel right now, activate the bell, and come with us to dive into more stories that defy logic, awaken your consciousness, and make you see the world with new eyes. Because reality is much bigger and much stranger than what they told you.